So by the looks of it, we're live. It's 7 o'clock here in Ireland, and well, I'd like to welcome everyone to our talk tonight, presented to you by Dr. Richard Stallman. Presenting it to you is us, the Computer Society in the University of Limerick in Ireland. We're, I don't know, a relatively small group of just students who come together weekly and discuss tech and everything involved in it, whether it be hardware, software, and just, I don't know, have a talk about it, do events, mess with software, mess with hardware, play games, whatnot. So that's just sort of what we do, and we decided we should get a guest speaker in, and one of our committee members suggested Dr. Richard Solomon, and he's been going at this for a good while, so we said we'll let him go and organize it, and here we are today. So, as I said before, welcome, Dr. Richard Stallman. I hope we'll get a good talk tonight, and the topic sounds very, very interesting, especially for the time we're in at the moment. So, he is, if people don't know, which is unlikely, but just a quick background: you're the founder of the Free Software Foundation, and a lead developer of the GNU operating system. And tonight you'll be talking about a free digital society. So thanks for coming and doing this. And I open the floor to you, and you can go ahead.
Okay, well, someone asked me if I had written a limerick for this talk, so I decided I had better do so. Here it is. They asked me to give them a speech, but their city I couldn't now reach. Someone said to use Zoom, but our freedom to a doom. So it's by Big Blue Button I'll preach. One drawback of this kind of remote talk is I don't know whether anyone applauded that or not. I'll have to imagine that people did. So people imagined that digital technology would make life much better and help people get to know each other better and work better with each other and be kind to each other and give everyone freedom. And as with other past technologies of which people had the same idea, it's not so. And when there are campaigns for digital inclusion, including people in the digital society, I started seeing those 20 years ago. I started to worry that they were going in the wrong direction. It's good to be included in digital society if it's a digital society with justice. But if it's an unjust digital society, what we should campaign for is digital extraction, getting us out of it. Well, at this point, it's not clear whether the just side or the unjust side will win. So we need to fight to have a just digital society, and that means it's important to tell people about the injustices that I see around me. And that's what this talk is about, several different topics of digital injustice. First, I'm going to talk about the most fundamental one, which is software that oppresses its users. Non-free software, because it doesn't respect freedom. So, first of all, when I say, hello, why is this not, oh, maybe it has to be there. Hello? Okay. When I say free software, it means freedom, not price. In French, I would call it libre, not gratuit. Most languages have a word that means free as in freedom and does not refer to price. It's always better to use them, and so we're sort of borrowing the French or Spanish word libre into English to have that meaning. it means that the software respects the freedom of the users. We're not talking about price. A freedom trampling program is often available gratis, especially now, but you're a fool if you use it. And also, people can sell you copies of free programs. There's nothing wrong with that. They're not supposed to be gratis. That's a side issue. So, what is a program? What is a computer? A computer is a universal digital execution platform. Fundamentally, all it knows how to do is get the next instruction and do what that says. And then it gets the next instruction and does what that says, and the next instruction and the next. So it gets these instructions one by one and does what they say. The instructions come from a program. You see, that's what has the instructions for the computer to run. So depending on what instructions the program has, it will do one thing or another thing or anything. With the right set of instructions, the computer could do absolutely anything, except for the things the computer can't do at all. So they can't be done. But aside from that, the computer does whatever the instructions direct it to do. So who wrote those instructions? Who gives the instructions to your computer? That is the fundamental question about computers and whether they treat you right or wrong. You see, you might think that you are telling the computer what to do when really it's someone else. You might think that your computer is obeying you when really it's obeying its true master all the time. And its true master tells it to do what you ask, except when it would rather not let you do the thing you asked. So, fundamentally, there are two possibilities for any program. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. There's no other way it can be. It's always one or the other. In order for the users to control the program, they need the four essential freedoms. Basically, sorry, I was supposed to say that a couple of slides ahead later. Basically, in order for the users to have freedom in their computing, they need control of the program. Why is that? Well, what is freedom? Freedom is having control of your own life, control of the things you do in your life. But if you're doing the things with a computer, by running a program, then in order for you to control the activities, you've got to control the program. So programs respect your freedom when you, the user, when the users control those programs. So in order for users to control the program, they need the four essential freedoms. These make the practical criterion for a free program. By the way, if anyone would like clarification of something I'm saying, please send that to the organizers as an urgent question, and I'll answer it right away as soon as I get it through the chat. The other questions I'll answer at the end. So, what are these four freedoms? Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program however you wish, to do whatever you wish for any purpose of yours. Now, there are purposes which are good, and there are purposes which are bad, and then there are lots of purposes which are morally neutral. They please you and they don't hurt anyone, so why not? But the freedom to run the program must not attempt to control what people can do with it, because that sets up a new form of oppression. And you'll find lots of companies that control what people can do with their non-free programs. We can't allow such control. Freedom one is the freedom to change the program to make it run the way you want it to run and do it the way you want it to do it. That requires access to the source code, because source code is the way we change programs. So what is source code? Well, you can see source code on the left. It looks sort of like a mixture of English and math. If you've learned that programming language, you can read it and understand it, and then you can change it. In order to run the program, we usually convert it into executable. You see that on the right. It's a series of ones and zeros, and it's not obvious what they mean, not even to a programmer. Of course, with such a small program as you see on the right, it wouldn't take you long to look up what those ones and zeros actually mean. But with a somewhat bigger program, it gets to be quite a chore. And for a real program, which might have 100 million ones and zeros, it would be almost impossible in practice. So if you can't figure out the program and you can't figure out where to put any changes, you can't change it. So you don't have Freedom 1. Freedom 1 requires access to the source code, and that includes the comments and the symbol names which the developers chose to help them understand what they had written. You have a right to the same thing, so you can understand it too. Well, Freedom 0 and 1 together give the users separate control over the program. Here we see 4 users of the same program. 3 of them are just running it, and 1 of them is exercising Freedom 1 to change it. So separate control is essential for users' freedom, but it's not enough. And the reason is that many users don't know how to program. Most users don't know how to program. They can't understand source code because they learned other things in their lives. They may have a wide range of different useful and important professions, which don't involve writing software. But they still deserve control of their computing. That's a fundamental right. How are they going to have control over their computing when they don't understand the source code? Not by changing the code themselves. Instead, they get it through collective control, which means that a group of users, any users, can form a group and start working on changes together. At the top here, we see a group of users working on changing a program. 2 of them are actually touching the source code. They appear to be programmers. The third one is not touching the source code and may not even be a programmer, but does participate in deciding what changes to make through the discussions that the people in the group have, the users in the group have, about what changes to make. Meanwhile, there can be other users that are not part of this group, because getting together and forming a group is something users are free to do when they want to. They don't have to. Other users could get together and form a different group, and they could make changes for different purposes. The changes made by one group might not be convenient for the other, and vice versa. They're free to do this however they like. Now, collective control requires 2 more essential freedoms. Freedom 2, to distribute exact copies of the program to others when you wish, either giving them or selling them to the others when you wish. And Freedom 3 is the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish, either giving them or selling them. These 2 make it possible for a group to function. The user at the left has made a modified version, and with Freedom 3 is distributing copies of that to others in the group, and one of them is using Freedom 2 to redistribute it to others without changing it. Of course, that user is free to change it also, but in this case, person is not changing it. Now, the group doesn't necessarily have a list of members or any rules about who could participate. Whoever participates is a member of the group. And so Freedoms 2 and 3 don't have any limits about who you can give or sell copies to. Whoever you want to, you can. You can offer copies to the general public. Anyone that has a copy is free to do so under Freedom 2. So now I should recapitulate the 4 freedoms, because those are the most important thing about free software. The 4 essential freedoms are Freedom 0, the freedom to run the program however you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1, the freedom to study the source code and then change it to make the program do its computing the way you wish. Freedom 2, the freedom to redistribute exact copies, either giving them to anyone or selling them to anyone when you wish. And Freedom 3 is the freedom to give or sell copies of your modified versions to other users when you wish. If the program comes with these 4 freedoms, then it's free software. It respects the user's freedom. It belongs in a just digital society. But if any of those freedoms is missing or incomplete, then the program doesn't respect users' freedom, and it takes away users' freedom. It does not belong in a just digital society. So if we want a just digital society, we've got to kick non-free software out of our lives. So with a non-free program, the program controls the users, and the program's owner controls the program. So this non-free program is an instrument of unjust power, power for the owner over the users. And naturally, this unjust power tends to corrupt the one that has the power, the owner of the program. And the corruption takes the form of malicious functionalities in the program. There are other ways the power can be unjustly used as well, but you've got to be on guard for the injustice in the code of the program that the users can't change. What do these programs do? Well, one thing is spy on the user. This example is the Amazon swindle, and Amazon's ebook reader, which for a while was a universal example. Every nasty thing was done by this one product. Not anymore. There are a few kinds of nastiness that it doesn't do. So how does it spy? Whatever the user does, it tells Amazon servers. It tells Amazon what book the user is reading, and which page, and how long the user stays on that page. If the user enters any notes or highlights anything, Amazon is informed of that too. Total surveillance of reading. But it's quite common. All the main operating systems of widely used products, the non-free operating systems, that is, they are spying on the user in one way or another. And then, of course, there are the programs that operate the Internet of Things. They're designed to spy on users too. I wouldn't allow any of those things into my home. Then it gets even worse. Some appliances whose purpose is to collect some data, they collect the data, they send it to the company, and the company offers to sell it to you. How what balls they've got offering to sell users their own data. There's another thing they can do. They can use that data to profile users and do other nasty things to them. But in addition, they can refuse to talk to the user anymore, and the appliance breaks. We call that a tethered appliance. And it has happened quite a few times that the manufacturer decided to shut down the server because it wasn't worth the cost of operating it. I've been asked whether the examples of code are on the are real. No, I just made up ones and zeros. But the fact that you can't tell proves an interesting point. People have asked me a number of questions which are not clarification of what I'm saying, so those should be saved for the end. So you buy a product that you're supposed to control by using your personal tracking and surveillance device, also known as portable phone, to send commands to the product, the appliance, but they go through a server set up by that company. And if the company ever decides to stop running that server, you can't make use of the functionality of your product. It may not operate at all. Now, this is why I believe that the only acceptable appliance to control digitally is one that gets commands directly from your own computer, which is running free software. That way, the manufacturer is not in a position to shaft you like that. But there's other kinds of nastiness. For instance, there's DRM, Digital Restrictions Management, the functionality of refusing to function or refusing to function for you. And this is implemented to stop people from copying things and even sometimes to stop them from looking at things. This example is the infamous Blu-ray, which attacks a user who is trying to do forbidden copying or forbidden sharing. And I'm told it hurts a lot, but it's never happened to me. You see, I consider products with digital restrictions management so abominable that I absolutely refuse to use them ever in any fashion. Well, except conceivably if I had free software that could break the DRM. That would remove the ethical reason to refuse to use it. But I'd much rather not have those products at all and not be tempted to even think of using them. Now, you'll find DRM in the Amazon swindle, in most DVDs, in all Blu-ray discs. The streaming disc services use DRM. That's one of the reasons they're unjust. But then there's even worse. There are back doors where the software in the product is designed to receive commands telling it to do something nasty to the user. Make sure that user isn't you. For instance, the Amazon swindle has a backdoor for remotely erasing books. We found this out when Amazon sent a command to, I think, more than 1,000 swindle devices, ordering it to erase a particular book. And guess what book it was? It was 1984 by George Orwell. The most ironic possible book to erase. But Amazon didn't care. Well, it didn't care immediately. There was a big backlash, and so Amazon promised it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. How comforting, especially for those who have read 1984. But actually, Amazon went back to remotely erasing books without even an order from the state. There are various other backdoors known. We have lists of these malicious functionalities. We have lists of hundreds of them in gnu.org/malware. So take a look. Meanwhile, a backdoor in a driverless car could be extremely dangerous because it could tell the car, because after all, the car knows it's you inside. The back door could be used to tell the car to take you to secret police headquarters with the doors locked. So think about various countries in the world that might use this. I am not confident that the US government wouldn't do this to people. But I don't want my movements to be followed at all anyway, so I would never use a driverless taxi, and I wouldn't use a driverless car that I owned unless I could change the software so it wouldn't indicate in any way where I was going. Got to make sure the antennas are not transmitting, because that's one thing that they will transmit. Oh, I just read that New York City is putting out electric scooters for rent, and they will be transmitting their locations very frequently, and of course the system will know who rented each scooter. So it will be tracking each user's movements precisely. Then there is censorship of applications. Apple pioneered censorship of applications because the eye monsters will only install an app from Apple's store. So if Apple decides to reject the app or delete it from the App Store, people can't install it unless they find ways to defeat this censorship. And they call that jailbreaking, which implies that the computer is a jail. So that's what we call computers with this malicious functionality. And then there is giving people a choice between basically this was the PS3's nasty thing. Users were told, tomorrow we're going to change the network protocol for gaming. So if you don't install this upgrade, you won't be able to play games anymore. But if you do install this upgrade, you won't be able to install gnu+linux anymore. So the people bought the product because it had two functionalities they could use, and they were forced to surrender one or the other. There are also universal backdoors. A universal backdoor is like a universal computer. The universal computer will execute any program. The universal backdoor can be used to forcibly install any change. Windows has had a universal backdoor since Windows XP. So if you're using that, if you're using Windows, and we're sure that Windows still has a universal backdoor, you're basically at Microsoft's mercy. There is nothing it couldn't do to you. And it could do this nasty thing to you only if it decides to. I'd say nobody should have that kind of power over your computer. And by the way, every portable phone has a universal backdoor in it. And in most phones, it can convert the phone into a full-time listening device. And once it's converted in that way, it doesn't really shut off either. You tell it to shut down, and it will display the things on the screen that usually indicate shutting down, but it won't really shut off. It'll keep on running and listening and transmitting all the time. I don't know whether airplane mode really operates. That's something somebody would have to find out by experimenting on a phone that has been made malicious. Now, sometimes a program will do various nasty things together. So the Netflix app spies on the user in various ways. It puts on the chains of DRM, and it imposes an anti-socializing contract or jerk-making contract, where you have to promise you will be nasty to your neighbors, a bad member of your community, by refusing to share with them. Now, I feel that it would be wrong for me to ever agree to such a contract, so I never have. Now, this is something that's not exactly a functionality in the software. It's an aspect of how the software is maintained. When Microsoft finds out about a security flaw in Windows, before sending out a patch, it will tell the NSA how to about the flaw and how to exercise it, and later it'll send out a patch. So it's basically betraying its customers to the NSA, the U.S. Digital Spying Agency. Now, we saw a news article about this practice on Microsoft's part, but there's no evidence that any other company does not do the same thing. It's an absence of evidence, not evidence of absence. We simply don't know what other companies do. So just about all users of proprietary software are using proprietary malware. And, you know, we know this. I've proved it to you because almost every user of proprietary software is using some of the malware I've just told you about as examples. And they do it because they make money through doing it. I only want to answer now the questions that are asking for me to clarify what I said. Lots of questions will be suggested by the points I'm making, but I'm going to answer them at the end. It's only if you don't understand what I said that I want to clarify it right away. So they found ways to make more money by mistreating users. And it's important to note that one and the same program can be released simultaneously in multiple ways. It can be released as free software. The same program could be released as non-free software, and it can even be released simultaneously in both ways. in parallel, like in different places or to different groups of people, or any kind of distinction that they could imagine, they could make. So it's not that certain code is inherently non-free, it's that the owner is releasing it as non-free software at the moment. Now, whether a program is free or non-free is one dimension. Whether it's malware or honest is another dimension. And those two dimensions are independent in principle. Any combination is possible. But in practice, they're correlated. Free programs tend to be honest, and non-free programs tend to be malware. Why is this? There's a systematic reason that's not too hard to see, and that is, well, the developers of the non-free program can gain advantage by putting in malicious functionality, and nobody can hold them accountable. Nobody can stop them. The only thing users can possibly do is refuse to use those programs. Well, you should refuse to use all non-free programs, but most users don't realize this. Most users won't actually reject the program for this. They may not even know about the malicious functionality, and besides, the rest of society is pressuring them in a nasty way to use these programs. It takes some determination to refuse. So the malware developers get away with it, and they don't stop. The only way to trust a non-free program is with blind faith, often in a company that has already mistreated users, and so it doesn't deserve that faith. But with free software, you can have rational trust in the program because there's a basis for it, a rational basis, and that is the fact that the user community looks at the source code. Not every user, of course. That's not necessary, though. There are groups of users who want to make some changes or who are packaging it in some way, and they will look at the source code, and there's a chance, therefore, that they will come across something malicious if there is, or a bug if there is. That happens a lot more often, coming across a bug. And either way, whether it was an accident or intentional, these users can publish a fix. They can release a modified version, and the result is they fix it for the whole community, including you. Even if it never occurred to you to look at the source code of that program, you get the benefit of what they are doing. With free software, the community protects itself, or better said, perhaps, the members of the community protect the rest of the community. This is the only known way to have confidence that a program is not malicious. It's not a guarantee. It's not perfect. We don't know of any perfect way to make sure a program is honest. But this is better than nothing. And what you've got with proprietary software is nothing. It's a system of distribution designed to swindle users. So learn the lesson. Don't use non-free software. Escape from non-free software and come live with us in the free world that we have built with the Linux kernel and the GNU operating system that Linux goes inside. We have made a place where users can be free. We've built an island of freedom in a world of digital injustice. I started developing the GNU operating system in 1984. By 1991, GNU was almost complete, and Torvalds developed a kernel, Linux, which fit into the last gap in the GNU system, forming I don't know. Can you see where I put my mouse pointer? Anyone?
You are now unmuted.
So this
You are now
is
muted.
the result. This is the gnu/linux system. It's the GNU system with Linux as the kernel that was made by combining the two in 1991. For the first time, there was a free operating system you could run on a PC, at least if you carefully chose which model of PC, and you could run it and have control over it yourself. You could run it in freedom. In principle, gnu/linux is a free operating system, but in practice, not always, because there are many different variants called distros. And each distro has its own maintenance team or development team, which decides what programs to put into it. And most teams will put non-free programs into their distros, at least a few, and often many. Well, those systems are not free operating systems. What a shame. So there are lots of distros which are mostly free software, but not entirely. And then there are a few which are entirely free software. In gnu.org/distros, you can find a list of the free ones and a lot more information, including precisely our criterion for judging. So I urge you to use free distros and recommend free distros. I simply won't recommend a non-free distro, just as I won't recommend a non-free program. Now, those who develop those non-free distros, why do they do it and what do they say about it? I will tell this person I can't talk now. Hello? Okay, I can't talk now because I'm giving another talk remotely. It started later than I thought it would. I know. Thank you. Bye. I thought this talk was starting at noon my time, and I gave someone the wrong information, alas. So they could say, oh, you deserve freedom. You must insist on freedom, but we won't give it to you. That wouldn't suit their purposes. So instead, they forget about freedom. They talk about other things, anything other than your freedom. Like, we offer the best user experience. That's what you'll hear from the developers of Ubuntu. So, when the developer of a distro talks about other only practical advantages and doesn't talk about freedom, that means something. So, what about free software licenses? Well, there are various different free software licenses. The license, by the way, is what makes the program free. A program with no license on it to permit copying means that copying is forbidden by copyright law, so it is non-free software. In order for the program to be free under today's unjust copyright law, it needs a license giving users the four freedoms. That's what the license is for. Legally, the license is what gives each user the four freedoms and thus makes it free software. But there are various ways to give these freedoms. For instance, there are weak licenses, pushover licenses, which give users the four freedoms but allow them to take those four freedoms off. It allows users to redistribute modified non-free versions of the code. And that happens. For instance, IBM took the code of Apache and put it into a non-free software product, which is basically Apache plus other features. So practically speaking, it may be an improvement, but in terms of freedom, it's a giant step back. So back in 1984, I saw the danger that this would happen, so I wrote a license to stop it. And the technique I invented was copyleft. Copyleft is a way of writing a license, so it gives users the 4 freedoms, but doesn't allow users to deny those freedoms to other users. So when you pass along a program with changes or not, you have to pass along the 4 freedoms to the subsequent users. So everybody gets freedom. And the result is that IBM has contributed to GNU software, contributed code that is copylefted. Because IBM wanted this code to be out there for users. And since it was not allowed to distribute a non-free modified version, the next best thing, as IBM saw it, was to give the code to us. And we said thank you when we included it, and users get it. So this is one reason why it's important to use copyleft on your code. In gnu.org/licenses, you'll find everything about free software licenses, and how to choose a license, and so on. Now, I'll skip this for now. So we want freedom, but there are obstacles. Well, one obstacle is the campaign in the name of open source. That label was coined in 1998 as a way of talking about free software, but forgetting about freedom, forgetting about the entire ethical level of the issue, presenting it purely as a matter of quality of code. Well, they have a right to say what they say, but I think it's a bad choice of philosophy. You know, to ignore the question of freedom is likely to lead to bad decisions. It can lead to horrible decisions. So where we say you should insist on free software so it respects your freedom, because freedom is a terrible thing to lose, they say we want better quality code, and if the source code is released, the users can improve the quality of the code, and then even the users who get it without getting freedom, they will get better features in their code. Well, that may be true, but I think it's a side issue, and ignoring the most important issue is a terrible mistake. But they had a lot of money for publicity, and what they're saying requires less deep thought to appreciate, so people took it up. It's not as controversial. It doesn't say that what many companies are doing is somehow unjust. So that idea of open source had a lot more success, and nowadays when important media talk about this area at all, they say open source, open source. They don't mention free or Libre or Saoirse or whatever word you can use. So we have to work very hard to inform the public we're even here. There were articles that referred to if they mentioned me, they might say the free software movement was a predecessor of open source. Hey, we're still here. We need you to tell other people, that we're still here and we're still fighting. That's one obstacle, and that's why, by the way, you will not find me using the word open in any meaning that is at all like this. I want freedom, and so when I describe these kinds of issues, I always put it in terms of freedom. Another obstacle is when the specifications of the hardware are secret. It's really hard to develop free software and make it run on a computer if you don't know how to control the peripherals, or if the instruction set is secret. And that really happens. So what we have to do is reverse engineering. Someone who's really clever has to figure out the secrets of how to control the hardware and write this down so that others can then write software to do these jobs. If you want to make an important technical contribution to the free software community, do reverse engineering. It's not easy, but once you learn the skills for doing it, you can make a contribution that will unblock progress in important theaters of conflict. And by the way, why not ask your school to start teaching reverse engineering? It's an important skill. It's in great demand. You can make good money from doing it. Why shouldn't the computer science department teach reverse engineering? And speaking of education, schools should teach exclusively free software. They should give exclusively free software to their students. And there are various reasons for this. And one of them is to teach the importance of freedom. So the school should not only direct students to use software that is free, it should tell them why the software in the school must be free. It shouldn't say, oh, here's the software we've chosen for you to use. No, it should say, we are going to prepare you to deal with the dangers of life and with the challenges of life in a political system by showing you software that respects your freedom. Because the school must not teach the use of a non-free program. That is teaching dependence. Getting people hooked on a non-free system is like getting them hooked on tobacco. The school must not do this. In addition, students can learn about life in freedom and about helping each other by making use of the four freedoms. For instance, if every classroom should have this rule: students, if you bring a program to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the class, sharing copies, that is. And if you don't want to share it, well, hand it to the teacher. The teacher will give it back to you at the end of the class. Of course, the school has to follow its own rule. It has to bring only free software to class and offer the source code to all the students. Oh, that's the other thing. If you bring any program to class, you got to bring the source code too. That should be the rule, in case anyone wants to know how those things are actually done. And here we get to another point, that every program embodies knowledge. It's false to say that software is knowledge. No, it embodies knowledge. And people who are interested in programming may want to learn that knowledge. And here you find an ethical difference. Free software shows that knowledge to the student because the student can get the source code, Whereas with non-free software, well, it conceals that knowledge from the student. So free software supports education, whereas non-free software is the enemy of the spirit of education. It must not be tolerated in a school. And this is very important for people who want to learn to be good programmers. How do you get to be a good programmer? You do it by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. But you can't get very far if the only code you can read is the code you have written yourself. You need to be able to read the code of programs that interest you and then practice enhancing them or fixing them, changing them one way or another. Well, with proprietary software, you can't do that. But free software gives you the opportunity to develop your skill as a programmer operating on very large programs. And that's exactly what you need to do to get good at that. So, human rights depend on each other in the sense that if you lose one human right, it becomes more difficult to defend the other human rights. Well, now that we do so many important social activities using software, the freedom to control the software we're using, the freedom for users to control the activities that they do together is now an essential human right. And if we lose it, it endangers our other human rights. We must get rid of non-free software and win for ourselves freedom in our computing. And sometimes that requires a sacrifice, a practical sacrifice, something you decide not to do because the alternative would be surrendering your freedom. Of course, when you value freedom enough, using that non-free program is the sacrifice, and rejecting it is refusing to make the important sacrifice that you don't want to make. It's keeping your freedom. So how can you help the free software cause? Well, you can write free software if you're a good programmer. I suggest you participate in 15 projects led by others before you start your own project. That way you'll have learned how to do a good job leading a project. But most people don't have that talent to be really good programmers, so it's better to contribute some other way with whatever skills are best. For instance, you can organize the movement to press for free software, and there's a tremendous need for that now in schools, to organize a demand to let the students do their work without non-free software. That is vital. So you can help persuade schools and governments to switch to free software. Governments should use exclusively free software because that is the computational sovereignty of the country. For a government to use software that it doesn't fully control is a terrible risk. You can, if you are an expert at using the gnu/linux system or free applications, whichever ones, you can help other users. That helps the community too. You can go to a gnu/linux user group and help users. If there's a gnu/linux user group, but it erroneously calls itself a Linux user group, that's a very frequent error. You can go there and help users and explain to people once in a while that the system is actually GNU plus Linux. It's the GNU operating system using Linux as the kernel. And just by saying free software, you're helping our cause. As instead of saying open, when you say open, you encourage people to focus on practical benefits, practical advantages or disadvantages only, and ignore freedom. If you look at what open source people normally say, they don't talk about freedom. So when you say free software or Libre software, or whichever other word that clearly means freedom and not zero price, people will understand. That's good. That way you're making it clearer. This is, of course, especially important for people in countries where the usual language is not English at all. They tend to borrow the English word free, which is making things worse than if they use their own word for the same term, for the same concept. Now, in gnu.org, you can find a lot more information. /help is a list of a lot more different kinds of work we could use, because we need many different kinds of volunteer work. There's not enough room in a talk to cover them all. /philosophy contains articles about various political and philosophical issues about free software. /licenses explains everything about licenses relating to free software. /government gives a lot of recommendations for how governments can migrate to free software gradually. It has to be gradually. A government uses too much software to migrate it in 5 years, say. /education gives all sorts of information to help in convincing schools to migrate or migrating schools. /GNU presents the history of the GNU project. /malware describes the hundreds of malicious functionalities we've found in non-free software. Actually, we usually find it because it's written about in the press and we have a reference to the article that described it. And /distros describes the free and the non-free distros and everything about those. So I've explained about free software. Now, the other topics I don't have slides for, so I'll just have to do them by voice alone. One thing is that the use of servers, which has increased tremendously over the past few decades, has led to additional problems. One thing is that if the job is done on a server, well, you can't possibly control the code that the server is using. The server might be using 100% free software, perhaps modified, perhaps it plus some application-specific code that was written by the server owner, and it is free software in a trivial way. The server owner is free to redistribute copies, but has chosen not to, so you can't get a copy. But even if you had a copy, you couldn't change the copy running on that server. Of course you couldn't. You'd have no right to change that. It's not your machine. Why should you be allowed to change it? But the result of doing your computing on someone else's server, that means you have no control over how your computing gets done. So the point is, don't do it on that server. We should use servers only to the minimal extent, and they should do the minimum part of the job that requires a server, and do it in a simple way that means there isn't a lot that is beyond the user's control, and that way servers are not mistreating us. Because there's another bad thing servers can do. They accumulate data, and the database puts users in danger because that data can be used against them. The data, once collected, will be misused. I say this because there are so many ways that the data can be misused. For instance, the company operating the server might decide to mistreat the users. Happens often enough. But there are other ways that don't involve the intentional mistreatment by the company. For instance, rogue employees can take the user and take the data and mistreat users with it. Or the company can make a mistake and leak the data, and those who get copies of it can mistreat users with it. Or a cracker can break the security of the machine and get a copy of the data and mistreat users with it. By the way, I ask you, please, when you're talking about people who break security on computers and get into them and do various things which might be nasty or might not, please don't call that hacking. Hacking means playful cleverness, and it can be in any area of life. It doesn't even have to be with computers. It doesn't. If it is with computers, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with security. So if you're talking about security breaking, please call that cracking. That way, when you talk about people like me, you'll be able to explain that you don't mean that we break security. I don't know how to break security. That's never been anything I dedicated much attention to. But I do enjoy playful cleverness, whether it's mine or other people's. So, uh, so, oh, and also one way the database can be misused is the government can seize it and use it to mistreat people. And there's a big push to give governments the power to seize any data that they want to seize. The US has a law called the Pat Riot Act, which allows the FBI to get a copy of almost any database of personal data just by asking. Doesn't even need to ask a judge to approve it. This is throwing away the defense of human rights that we have evolved over centuries. It's terribly dangerous. It's more dangerous than terrorism. So collecting the data is where we have to is the problem. So initiatives for so-called data protection are missing the point. They're starting at a stage too late in the process to achieve the goal properly. The GDPR will do some good, but because they're mostly focused on how the data are used and only a little bit on stopping the data from being collected, the criteria for being allowed to collect data are too easy to satisfy. So they're not really going to be effective. And besides, they omit completely any so-called security surveillance, meaning the most dangerous form of taking and perhaps abusing the data about people is not covered at all by the GDPR. I saw a disgusting thing in a visit to Rennes. I saw that my host, when parking the car in town, had to put his license plate number into a computer in order to be allowed to park. So this means that whether or not he parks too long, he's being surveilled. Now, this is horrible. Proper privacy legislation would prohibit a system like that. It would say you must not identify people unless they park too long. Don't collect their identifying information. If they park too long, yes, then you can identify them because you need to find them or you want to find them. That's okay. But people who are not parking illegally should not be tracked. So with that approach, you can start thinking about privacy legislation that will really do some good. Now, speaking of surveillance, one important way of surveilling people is through the software in their computers. And that's one thing that free software can protect us from. With free software, we can make modified versions that doesn't give data about us. So our privacy is protected. But there are other surveillance systems. There are systems that we use but don't belong to us. For instance, your network connection. Your internet service provider is probably keeping track of what websites you talk to. In the US, it will use this for commercially motivated mistreatment of people, for profiling them. And, well, in some places, they're not allowed to use that data commercially, but they still give it to the state, so your privacy is still ripped apart. I believe that they should have to get a search warrant to take down a record of what sites you connect to. That, again, that's the tradition of protecting the privacy of people who are not suspects. We need the state to be able to investigate crimes and find the perpetrators, yes. But the state should not be able to collect data about everybody and perhaps notice later that someone committed a crime when it decided it wanted some excuse to arrest that person for saying something that's not approved. So those systems, in theory, we wouldn't have to use, but it's really hard to do much avoiding them. It's a substantial sacrifice. When I travel, I do that, actually. I never connect to the internet in a way that identifies me, except in my home, where I don't know a way to avoid it, actually. Now, I don't mind, of course, when I'm visiting somebody, I don't mind that my host knows who is using the internet, but I don't want the internet service provider to know. And at a home system, generally, that it's easy to prevent that. Now, there are also systems that exist only for surveillance, like the parking meter system in Rennes. Well, that shows how outrageous they can get. You can compare that to the cameras in the street designed to recognize everybody and track everybody. If anyone thinks that should be allowed, tell them to move to China, that he'd feel comfortable there. Now, another important issue has to do with elections. We must not trust computers with the ability to mark ballots. We need to vote on paper, making marks on the paper by hand. Well, it doesn't have to literally be a hand, but it must not be a computer. Because if a computer can mark the ballot, it can vote wrong on your behalf. Yes, it could show you the completed ballot before dropping it in the urn. And if people check it carefully, that might be reliable, but people don't check it carefully. And with such machines, it often turns out people have no idea what to do if they see that what it wrote on the ballot, what the computerized voting machine wrote on the ballot, is not the choice that they put in. Those people, they don't know what to do. They're not told really what to do often. And the reliable solution is have paper ballots marked by the humans so they can be recounted without any chance, and thus avoiding any chance for computers to mess up the election irrevocably. So, one thing that oppresses people who use computers is digital restrictions management. Now that is part of a long story, which I call the war on sharing. You see, publishers don't want us to be able to share copies of works. However, digital technology is useful because it makes it easier to do various things, and one of them is sharing copies. Now, sharing copies is good because it's a way of cooperating with the rest of society. Sharing copies should be encouraged. Sharing copies should be lawful. So we have this conflict between publishers and individuals. And back in the 1980s, publishers started developing ways to make it impossible to share something. Well, the first thing they did was just call names. They started calling the users that share with other users pirates. Well, that smear term had previously been used by authors to describe publishers that published works without permission. It was the publishers who turned it around and aimed it at people who read the books, starting to call readers pirates. Well, I reject that term. I don't use the term piracy to refer to sharing, because piracy means attacking ships. It's very bad, and I condemn it. But sharing is good, so let's not cause moral confusion by using the same word for the two. When people ask me what I think of movie piracy, I say, I liked the first Pirates of the Caribbean. So if they had only used propaganda like this, it wouldn't be a war, but they went far beyond that. They started developing various kinds of systems to stop sharing, DRM systems, and but they didn't stop there. Then they started making it illegal to technically defeat the DRM systems. They made it illegal to release software that can copy the things that they don't want people to be able to copy. Unjust laws, first in the US, then in the European Union, then in various other countries. Well, these laws have no moral authority. There's no reason you should your conscience should not have any qualms about sharing copies with other people. But in some countries, they enforce this in such a repressive fashion that people are scared to help each other. Divide and rule, that's what we see. And then they went even further. The latest stage is making it a crime to share copies. In Japan, the punishment the punishment for illegally downloading a copy of anything from the internet is a year in prison. But if that's not enough, I guess they'll extend it to 10 years. These companies that lobby for more power and more repression, they make so much money that they don't care how nasty they get, unless we push back in a very strong, very determined fashion. You've got to be prepared to do that. So they say that the reason for this is that people who share are stealing from the authors. There are two falsehoods in that. One is it's not stealing if you don't agree that it was wrong in the first place. We used to have the right to share, and we should still have the right to share. But the other falsehood is the idea that it's coming from the authors or the artists. Actually, the same companies that are waging this war on sharing are gradually diverting the money to them and letting the authors and artists get less and less and less, except for a few, the ones who are stars, but they have so much they don't need more. So it's what they're doing with that propaganda is not only morally misrepresenting the issue, but in addition, misrepresenting the question of who is taking the money from those authors and artists. So we should reject their claim that the rights holders have to be compensated. That's two more swindles. When they say compensated, well, that's trying to suggest it's a matter of making up a loss. But if we should have the right to share, then nobody's losing anything. You don't lose something if you weren't entitled to it at all. And it also implies making up for damage, and that's limiting the thinking. But the other swindle is when they say rights holders. You're supposed to imagine that means the authors and artists, but usually it isn't. Usually that's the companies. So they have a way of giving the impression they're proposing a scheme to support artists, which won't support the artists. So forget about all that. Reject anything couched in that language. Let's look for a way to support artists and authors better. That, I think, is a good goal. And but it doesn't mean we should try to stop people from sharing. In fact, we shouldn't try to discourage sharing. Just the opposite. With good ways of supporting authors and artists, everyone will want to encourage sharing. So I propose two ways. One is there should be some tax money should be made available to distribute to authors and artists. Now, this can come out of general revenue, or there can be some special purpose tax of whatever kind. It doesn't matter much. because this system is so much more efficient at using the funds that with much less money than now, we can support creative people much more than now. And here's what makes it more efficient. You distribute the money in proportion to the cube root of each author or artist's popularity. You measure popularity somehow. It doesn't have to be exact. You could use polling of some sort. So you get a rough idea of the popularity of each author or artist, and you take the cube root of each, and then you divide up the total sum in proportion to the various cube roots. Now, what does the cube root do? It means that compared with the stars, the less popular artist share is increased by the cube root. Suppose A is a star and B is not. Suppose B is just a fairly successful artist, but not known around the world. So A might easily be 1,000 times as popular as B. With linear proportionality of distribution, A would get 1,000 times as much money as B, which means B would get essentially nothing important. It wouldn't do much good. But with the cube root, A would get 10 times as much as B. So instead of these tremendously distant numbers, you get numbers that are not so far apart. The share that the star A gets becomes less with the cube root, and so the share for each non-star is increased by the cube root. Now, cube root may not be the ideal function. Maybe we want fourth root, or maybe we want square, maybe we want the 0.38 power. Some economists can figure out these details. The point is, we want to direct more of the money to the non-famous, not so successful, but somewhat successful. Not the nobodies that hardly anyone's interested in. The artists for whom more support would be good for the arts. That's what this system would do. The stars don't need it, and of course the ones that hardly anybody pays attention to, it won't do that much good there. Probably. There are these geniuses, but there are not too many of them, and I guess they'll have to find patrons, but maybe they will. In any case, the other system is voluntary payments. Imagine if every player device had a button you could push to send a certain amount of money to the artists. And the amount of money would depend on the country. The optimum size of contribution would be bigger in a country where people are better off, because the goal would be to maximize the total amount donated per day. And then when you listen to something, if you like it, you could push the button, or afterward you could push the button, and then you'll make this small donation. Or else you won't push the button. Nothing will pressure you to do it. You won't be accused of somehow cheating the artists if you don't support them. But when you send the money, you'll feel good. And with small payments like this, the crucial thing is to make it as easy as possible. That's why I say put the button in every player. Of course, it should be an anonymous donation. And one way to do that is to use gnu+linux. gnu+linux is our anonymous payment system, which is now at the stage of being integrated with European banking systems. It works, but it's not in use yet. I hope that it will be fairly soon. The idea of gnu+linux and how it's superior to cryptocurrencies is it's meant for non-astronomical payments. You might not be able to send €1,000 through Toller, but you'll be easily able to buy things every day with it over the internet or in person. And the payer is anonymous. That works through blind signatures. But the payee is always identified. The store that you're paying has to turn in the payments, so it can't evade taxes this way. That's very important. Tax evasion, basically by the rich, is causing large amounts of wealth to go off the books. Governments are saying they can't afford to do good for anybody, and the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. This is one of the important means by which the Nebar takes from the poor and gives from the rich. So Toller is designed to do the right thing in both directions. The businesses can't hide their income, but purchasers can be anonymous. So we could easily envision setting up a system to support authors and artists that way. These two kinds of systems can be combined in various fashions. There are all sorts of ways to support authors and artists, but giving the money to a few giant companies is not one of them. So the next point I want to talk about is the fact that you have no right to do anything in particular on the internet. You have no right that you can make a claim on to state your views in the internet. If you have an opinion you want to show other people, you can write it on a sign and you can walk around for people to see it. You can put it on the outside of your house. You can print leaflets and hand out leaflets. And you don't need a special authorization to do that. It's everybody's right. But on the internet, in order to do that, to do any of those things, you need a computer with an internet connection. It may need to be a especially high bandwidth connection. It may need to be a powerful computer. You need a domain name registrar. They can kick you off. I don't know about here, but in most places they can always find an excuse to kick you off if they even need an excuse. They can just cancel your contract, which means that you can only present your views over the internet on sufferance, as long as some companies are willing to cooperate with you. In general, we must not allow companies to write their own terms and conditions. I don't know about here, but in Boston, if you rent an apartment, the landlord is not allowed to choose arbitrarily the terms and conditions. The law says what conditions are permitted. Any other conditions in the lease are null and void, as the landlord will find out on going to court to try to evict you. If you bring up this point, at least. I've never been in an eviction hearing. I don't know exactly what it's like. But the laws are written to defend tenants' rights, saying once you rented this, you have the right to use it in lawful ways. There are only certain kinds of conditions the landlord can make. But that's not the case with any kind of internet service that you rent the use of. The company can write its own conditions and then judge whether you violated them. So it's the judge, the jury, and the executioner for your internet activity. We have to change that. We have to have laws specifying the conditions to kick anyone off of some internet or digital activity. Now, there is somewhat the start of that in the European Union. There was a US government campaign, unofficially, a campaign to stop people from donating to WikiLeaks and kick WikiLeaks off the internet. And it worked by pressuring the various companies that provided services that WikiLeaks needed. For instance, its domain name registrars, its systems for receiving funds. Various payment companies were pressured to refuse to send money to WikiLeaks. So a company in Iceland started accepting donations on behalf of WikiLeaks, and the credit card companies kicked it off. And then it came to an end because in European Union law, the credit card companies had more than 10% of the market, so they were not allowed to kick off any customer, any client arbitrarily. They had to justify it, and they couldn't. So the company won the lawsuit and was reconnected. But this doesn't apply to the whole world. So we need to make sure that companies don't decide arbitrarily who to kick off. Then we must make sure they don't decide what the rules are, because that's tantamount to being able to decide arbitrarily. We need democratically decided conditions for any kind of internet service. Well, the ones that are unusual, I suppose, there'll have to be a period of time when society gets used to them before there are any laws about them. But once they're fairly established, you know, for instance, an ISP, a domain name registrar, being mentioned in a search engine, these have to be regulated by democratically made laws. So that's my talk, and now it's time for questions. So let me start by answering the questions I've got in the chat. What about mail servers? Not everyone can host per own mail server. That's true, and I don't have a full suggestion for mail servers. It's not an area I've dedicated a lot of thought to. Mainly, this is because email is not designed to allow any kind of privacy about who's getting mail or who's sending the mail even. It does allow privacy for the body of the message if you encrypt it with the GNU privacy guard. But that's as far as privacy goes in email. Is processing that data not a service and worth being paid for in reference to the likes of Fitbit? Well, if the server were to say, we offer you a supplementary kind of processing of the data, and if you want, and we'll charge for that, but you don't have to get it. But the data itself were available to you as the owner of the Fitbit in comprehensible form, I don't think that would be immoral. Are universal backdoors acceptable in certain circumstances? For instance, business PCs that need to be remotely updated for security reasons? Well, I wouldn't call that a backdoor. If the business is the owner of the PC, then it can set up whatever it wants. You know, if the system is free, it can set up on that PC whatever it wants to set up. That's not the same as a backdoor included by the manufacturer that made the PC and sold it. Now, there's a different issue, which is to what extent should businesses be able to tell employees to use a machine whose software is locked down, and under what conditions? There's a lot of surveillance of employees by businesses, and it is oppressive. It needs to be limited by law. And excessive surveillance needs to be a crime for which the managers or other employees who decided to turn it on are legally responsible and can be imprisoned for what they have done. What is your opinion on the push for a cashless society? It's terribly dangerous. I resist it by paying only cash when I buy things. No cash, no sale. I have a button that says, don't be tracked, pay cash. It's not useful to wear it now because people shouldn't get close enough to me to be able to read it. But that's still my policy. And a few times I've gone into stores where they told me that they wouldn't take my cash. And then I tell them, too bad, because I only pay cash. I defend my privacy. You have no right to know who I am. Now, if the salesman, if the cashier knows who I am, that doesn't bother me. You know, if we get into discussing software freedom issues or other political issues, I might say who I am. I might say my personal website is stallman.org, but I don't want the business's computer system to know who I am, and I make sure of that by only paying cash. For paying my bills for businesses with whom I have accounts that have to have my name in them, then I use a check. I can't do online banking because in my bank, and perhaps in all banks, that requires running non-free JavaScript code. That's one bad thing, unjust thing that a lot of websites do. They require the visitor making a transaction with the site to run non-free software in per own computer, and I won't run it, so I just don't use those sites unless I can get around it. So basically, people should organize and demand that stores accept cash. They should demand laws that require stores to accept cash. In New York City, I believe restaurants are required to accept cash. And that was so that they wouldn't exclude people who don't have credit cards and don't have smartphones. That is apparently a serious problem for a different group of people. I do have a credit card. I don't have a portable phone. But I could pay one of those restaurants, but I refuse to do it. I won't pay with my credit card except for an airline ticket. And I use it for that because they demand that I identify myself anyway. So I hope that you will join in this campaign. Defend your freedom. What do you think of ARM-based computers? Well, as far as I know, they don't have the hardware backdoors that Intel and AMD computers have, at least not yet. So maybe they're better. But they're often put together with GPUs that have secret interfaces and therefore that we can't manage to use from the free world. Now, I don't object to a peripheral that comes with non-free firmware inside it. It would be useless to try to fight that at present because the keyboard, the camera, and the disk drive all have non-free firmware inside. But since that's hidden inside them and the users don't ever install anything there, it doesn't raise a moral conflict that you have to confront. But if the peripheral comes empty. If it needs non-free firmware, but that firmware is not in the peripheral, so you have to install it, or you have to put it into your operating system so it will install that firmware when it starts up, you can't disregard that. You can't finesse the issue away. So I don't use those peripherals, and the Free Software Foundation won't certify as respects your freedom a computer which has peripherals like that. And so those GPUs can't be used in the free world, and lots of computing, lots of users are now prisoners of the GPU. So this is an area that's very hard to work on at the software level. Reverse engineering can do it, and there are groups that gradually reverse engineer some of the interfaces to those GPUs. And if you get to be good at that and you join one of those groups, you will enable it to make faster progress, and that's very important because they tend to lag far behind. With more help from capable people, they might advance, they might catch up, and that would change things greatly. What's the number one obstacle for mass adoption of free software in our society? Well, I don't know exactly, but I tend to think it is mobile software with tens or hundreds of thousands of malicious apps. And by the way, most apps for smartphones are malicious. Someone did a study of the most popular Android apps, I think 1,000 or so, checking for one kind of surveillance that was easy to detect by looking at the binary of the app without the source code, because these apps were basically all proprietary. And the study found that of the paid apps, 60% did this kind of surveillance, and of the gratis apps, 90% did this surveillance. I think it had to do with having tracking tags attached to the app somehow, so that it wasn't the code of the app that was doing the surveillance. It was some metadata attached to the app, which was why the study was able to detect it. So you can be sure that if software is non-free and if it's made for anything but an extremely small specialized clientele, it's almost certainly malicious. So treat it as malicious. Don't wait for proof that a specific non-free program is malicious. It should be the default assumption. So we can't replace those apps because there's so many of them. So you have to get used to doing without that. But remember, a smartphone that can run those apps is spying on you constantly. The phone network can track you by triangulation. It doesn't even need the help of the software in the phone. That's why I don't have any kind of mobile phone. So, but there are various other big obstacles too. Most computing has become subjugatory, and I am staying out of it. What is a good way to convince family and friends to switch to at least some free software? Well, you can't always do it, right? There's no recipe for convincing other people of something, especially if it is slightly inconvenient or controversial. What can you do? They make up their own minds. But some things that help are don't be too pushy, don't bring it up too often, bring it up in a gentle sort of way, but bring it up together with saying no for yourself. So if somebody says, please join our Zoom call, you can say, I would love to talk with you, but I refuse to use Zoom. I think it is an injustice to users, and I've decided to stay away from it. And since you're not making a demand of them, they can't really justify getting angry at you. They could try to be pushy, they could try to be demanding, but it's obvious that it's not right. So you just have to stick to it. And you can suggest, we could use Jitsi, we could use Big Blue Button, we could use gnu+linux. And that way, we'd be using software that doesn't subjugate users. And if they say, what do you mean subjugate users? You could say, well, the users don't have any control over this thing about how it works. Even programmers like me, they won't let us see what it's doing, and we know it spies on people. So this way, you might be able to convince some of them. It helps. You could say no on one occasion alone. You don't have to say no all the time. And you might actually persuade people on that one occasion. But there's an advantage in having a policy where you always say no on principle, which is that if they're asking you to make an exception to your principles of conscience, then it's obvious why you're not going to yield. Whereas if there's no principle involved, they can figure they'll just push you harder, and eventually you'll give in. So it's easier to do it with a principle. Do you give any kudos to big tech for embracing open source and bringing more users into the world of gnu/linux inadvertently? It did some good. I agree. But because I believe that the ethical level of the issue is the most important level, and because that's the level they don't mention, I've decided I will never use the term open source. I do not say that they are evil. I say they're missing the point. But I don't want to miss the point. And if I ever said open, I would be missing it, so I make sure I don't. I wrote an article that addresses these issues exhaustively, and it's called Open Source Misses the Point. You mentioned 1984. What other books would you recommend? Oh boy. And do I have a favorite film? No. There are various films that I've enjoyed. Most of them wouldn't come to mind right now. My memory doesn't work in that direction very well. It hasn't worked very well in that direction for decades. Something has to jog the specific memory. Just asking me about a category and what are some members of that category. It doesn't work with my memory. And but in terms of books, the problem is there's so many books I've read, and in so many different fields and areas. Some are fiction, some are nonfiction, and so I wouldn't know what to say. I just finished reading the book Exhalation by, I think it's Ted Chiang. Uh, I'm not sure of my memory of his first name, but in any case, the last story in that book was breathtaking. Uh, it was a hypothetical quantum device, and then he investigated social implications, including people who were going to quite extensive lengths of cleverness to find a way they could make some money for it. Because it wasn't easy to find any way. You know, it's communicating with yourself in a parallel world that's separated from this one parallel when you push the button on the device. And it's not so obvious how you would get real advantage from it at all. But it did cause people a lot of psychological upset and neuroses. Well, uh, I read a book uh, last fall, Angkor by Michael Coe, which is actually the history of Cambodian civilization, because a lot has been learned from many stages in the history of Cambodia and the bigger historical trends that led to the construction and advance and lack of maintenance of Angkor. And having once visited Angkor, because I was always fascinated and finding some parts of it extremely beautiful, I found that book fascinating too. But then I've always been interested in ancient history and history of other cultures. What do you think about free software mobile phones like the Purism Librem 5? Well, the Purism phone goes to tremendous lengths to try to resist the danger of the back door, the universal back door in the modem processor. That's what allows them, meaning anybody who knows the secret of doing this, governments, drug gangs, whoever it happens to know and be willing to ignore. And if they're not the state, they have to ignore laws. But and it succeeds in that the modem processor is not connected to the microphone. The microphone is connected to the application processor, which is running free software, and therefore we can presume that the users have made it refuse to let the modem processor hear what's coming in the microphone. So it should protect you from that danger. They can't stop they can't protect the universal backdoor from operating, but if somebody uses it, the thing still can't get to the microphone. In addition, they can prevent it from tracking your movements because you've got a power switch for transmission. If you flip that switch, it's not going to transmit anything. So the phone network can't follow you. But if you want to be able to receive calls, you have to have that turned on, which means it can track you. So I'm not sure that I would want to have the thing. What good would it be if it wouldn't let me answer calls? Well, I've got an idea. If I carry a one-way pager, I could tell people, page me, and when I get your page and I find out what you want to talk with me about and how urgent it is, I'll decide at which place to reveal my location by turning the phone on, and then I'll be able to talk with you. Well, in theory, that would work if you're in a place where there is a one-way pager system. I don't know how many countries still have that, but I might need to get a different one-way pager for each country I visit, and I don't know whether it's worth it. So I just go around without a mobile phone. You mentioned services like banks and airports are requiring biometric identification. Wait, I didn't say biometric. Well, if biometric includes photo, yes, airports do. My bank doesn't have my fingerprints. My bank does have my photo and has for decades. So do you think it might be impossible to travel without being surveilled in some way in the future? And can we combat this? It may very well be impossible. China has made it impossible. Basically, if your government starts doing something like this, say you're becoming as bad as China. The people need to understand where you live is not China, but the worst aspects of China can come to you. And you've got to throw that in the face of politicians that want to surveil people more. You've got to demand the elimination of systems that track people that much. It's got to be possible to walk, drive, or ride a bus or a train anonymously and not be identified by any systems unless there is some specific justification to track you, such as plausible grounds to suspect you of a crime. The danger of surveillance of the masses of people is that it becomes a fishing expedition, looking for evidence against everybody and anybody. So I've caught up with all the questions. I could answer a few more. Wow, that's all. I'm shocked. How many people were in the audience? 5?
There were quite a good few. I think we had peak 90 on the stream, and then I'd say a couple might have been watching together. So 90 to maybe 100 people.
Oh well.
Plenty of questions.
I won't complain. I got lots of work to do. Now, if this were an in-person presentation, I would present Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs, but I don't think I'm going to do that remotely. It would be too much trouble, and we'll do without. So anyway, happy hacking, people, and thanks. And if you want, I hope you will join the Free Software Foundation at fsf.org. You'll pay dues, which will support activities to boost free software. But you can't expect money alone to do it. You have to be prepared to put your time in, and you have to be prepared to say no. Say no by yourself. Say no together with others. And I wrote an article, gnu.org/philosophy/saying no even once.html. Saying no even once is help. If in one of your classes you say, teacher, I don't want to use that system because it's unjust. Please give me another way to do this, to hand in my papers, hand in my homework, take the test, whatever. Say no to those procto systems. By the way, procto is a prefix meaning asshole, which is entirely fitting for them. Those programs are malware. You know, every inch of the code is malware. And if I were asked to take an exam that way, I'd say, I'm not going to run that program, but I'd be happy to take this on a computer belonging to the university. If you set it up in some office in the university, I'll go there and I'll take the exam on that computer. And then, since it will be like a kiosk, the university's kiosk that I'm using, it won't matter to me what software is in it. It's none of my business, and I don't care. And it can take pictures of me all the time while I'm taking the exam, and I don't care. You could watch me in person too through a window if you like. So this is fundamentally reasonable. You see, it's not demanding anything that conflicts with what the university needs as part of properly giving an exam. So it's a reasonable thing to push for. And sometimes people get it. So there are apparently a few more questions. I still have a few more minutes. I suggest that somebody make buttons that say, don't be tracked, pay cash, or no cash, no sale, no cash, question mark, no sale, or some other slogan that you think will be clear to everyone, and start selling the buttons and wearing the buttons. What do I think of Tox.chat? I actually don't know. I don't know anyone who has studied it and could evaluate it properly for me. So for all I know, it might be good. I suppose it would be nice if we had more information about that. Oh, government agencies often cite security concerns as a reason not to use free software. Well, they're nuts. I mean, they're making a foolish, naive error thinking that obscurity is going to give them security. The way to get security is to use a free program and organize efforts to study the source code systematically, looking for errors, or perhaps something malicious might be found, but most likely it will be errors, and fix them. Can the principles of free software be applied to hardware? Yes, in theory, but in practice, it doesn't have the same effect. First of all, it's not the hardware that can be described as free or non-free. Free hardware or open source hardware, they're both confused concepts, because what can be free is the design of hardware. But you'll notice that in any physical piece of hardware, there will be design at various levels. You know, there's a design of the circuit board, and there's the design of the circuit of each chip, and there's the, you know, there may be the microcode in the computer, and then there are various parts of the computer. You know, there's sub-assemblies that might have been made by different companies. So to ask, is this, as a lot of people will foolishly ask, is this open hardware? Well, what does that even mean? But if you formulate it as whether a given hardware design is free or not, then it becomes clear, because any given level of the hardware has its design, and that design may be free, and the design of some other level may not be free. You can find some pieces of hardware where the circuit design the circuit of the top level circuit of the device is free, but the circuits inside the chips are not. But with the concept of free hardware design, you have a way to state that answer. Now, at the moment, the fundamental difference between the hardware field and the software field is we can make our own versions of hardware and we can share them with people and everyone can easily use them. But to manufacture a chip, you've got to mass produce it, and that costs a lot to start the run. So making 10 copies of a specially designed chip is not feasible. Making 10 copies of a specially designed version of a program is feasible. And it's because of that that the free software community works. The free hardware community has trouble working in the same way, at least with today's technology. But that can change. It may be that in 20 years, many of us are using hardware that we made from free circuit designs. We may eventually even be able to do the same thing to chips. When you established GNU, did you imagine that private companies would be able to exert as much control as they have today through their use of computer technology? No. I couldn't forecast that kind of thing in the future. It was a surprise to me. I didn't realize, I considered the possibility that someday lots of people would use computers, but I didn't really know that that would happen. I wasn't thinking that far ahead. I was thinking ahead with the idea that we could get the GNU system done, even though at the beginning there were just a few components being worked on. I was confident we would be able to develop an entire operating system. And so, indeed, we did. So, I guess I will sign off now, and happy hacking, everybody.
Perfect. Thanks very much. That was great. Very, very informative. And I just want to say we all appreciated the limerick. That was very good.
Thank you. I hope that was more than informative. I hope that this will inspire people to stand up for their rights, to organize for freedom.
Well, for sure, definitely me personally, it's definitely got me thinking about the whole everything I use daily and seeing what could I cut back, what could I change. Maybe start with changing my OS. That might be a good start. And
yeah, but here's the thing. Liberating yourself is a good thing to do because it recovers some freedom in your own life. But if we're going to win this campaign, it will be because of people who went beyond just throwing non-free software out of their own lives. You've got to help others throw the non-free software out of their lives. You've got to organize with others to demand that government make respect for freedom part of the basis of its policies. It's a matter of changing the system. And so all the things that are needed for other changes in the system are likely to be needed for this one too.
Definitely. That's where the hardest struggle is, making sure or convincing others around you to do the same.
There's a need for a national digital privacy society which campaigns against collecting data about people. It's vital to redirect the existing movement that demands data protection into a movement for digital respect for privacy.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, that's for sure. Thanks very much for coming. And we all like that you used the Irish word saoirse for another term for Libra. So it's very, very good. And yeah,
I was worried that I had mispronounced it, perhaps, because my memory was not certain.
you
I
did a
was
good job.
worried I would have been terribly embarrassed. What a horrible mistake to make.
No, it's all good. It's perfect. I'm pretty sure there's plenty of people listening who struggle with their Irish as well. So we're all in the same boat. But yeah, thanks very much.
Okay,
Appreciate
by the
it.
way, I made a recording of all of this.
We have as well. So
Oh,
we'll have
good. So I won't have to send you mine. It would
plenty
take
of.
a long time. Okay, bye.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll put the video uploaded onto the same link as you got it for the stream. And thanks everyone for
Well,
coming and
wait,
watching.
one thing, please put on it CC by ND.
Will do.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye bye. Thanks very much.